He built his career on tearing apart religious beliefs, but when he turned his scrutiny on one student, her response shook him to his core. Dr. Eric Holloway was a man who thrived on debate. In his eyes, nothing was sacred. Not beliefs, not traditions, and certainly not faith. He had spent nearly 2 decades at Brighton University, challenging students to question everything they thought they knew. Some admired him for it. Others dreaded his lectures. His philosophy class was one of the most sought-after yet feared courses on campus. Those who signed up knew what they were in for: public scrutiny, relentless questioning, and the occasional humiliation if they couldn't defend their arguments. Holloway had a particular distaste for anything he deemed irrational, and religion was at the top of that list. That Wednesday afternoon, the class was nearly full. The air inside Hamilton Hall carried the quiet hum of anticipation as students settled in, flipping through their notes and preparing for another heated discussion. The walls, lined with old leather-bound books and faded portraits of past professors, gave the room an almost theatrical feel. It was the kind of setting that made every debate feel larger than life. Holloway leaned against the desk, tapping his pen against his palm as he scanned the faces before him. That was his ritual, picking apart the crowd, searching for his next intellectual opponent. Then his gaze landed on Imani Rhodes, a junior sitting near the middle of the room. She wasn't the type to draw attention, always punctual, always prepared. She listened more than she spoke. Her presence steady but quiet. A philosophy major with a sharp mind, she had earned his respect. Not that he would ever say it out loud. But today, something caught his eye. A delicate gold cross rested just below her collarbone, its small frame glinting under the classroom's fluorescent light. It was subtle, almost easy to miss. But to Holloway, it stood out like a beacon. His lips curled into a smirk. "Miss Rhodes," he called, his voice cutting through the low murmurs. Imani looked up, her fingers tightening slightly around her pen. "Yes, Professor." Holloway took a step forward, tilting his head as if studying an abstract painting. "Tell me something," he began, his tone casual, almost amused. "That necklace of yours, is it just for decoration? Or does it actually mean something to you?" A few students shifted in their seats. Imani blinked, processing the question. She glanced down at the cross, her thumb grazing over its smooth surface. "It means something," she answered simply. Holloway nodded, pretending to give it some thought. "I see. So you wear it because you believe in what, exactly?" Imani knew where this was going. She had seen it before, how he set his traps, how he chipped away at people's convictions until they were left scrambling for solid ground. Still, she held her posture, calm and steady. "I wear it because it reminds me of where I come from," she replied, her voice even, "and what's guided me through life." Holloway let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Fascinating," he mused. "A symbol, given meaning by nothing more than personal sentiment. And yet, if you had been born in another part of the world, you might be wearing something else entirely. A crescent, a star, or maybe nothing at all. Ever think about that?" A few students exchanged glances, sensing the tension rising. Imani didn't flinch. "I have," she said. "But," Holloway's smirk widened. He leaned back against his desk, crossing his arms like a man who had already won an argument before it even started. "But," he repeated, prompting her to continue. Imani met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I've thought about it," she said, "and I understand that different people believe different things. But that doesn't change what this means to me." Holloway let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Ah, yes. The ever-persistent human tendency to cling to the familiar. Tell me, Miss Rhodes, have you ever questioned it? Or is it just something you accept because it was handed down to you like an old family recipe?" A few soft laughs rippled through the room. Not cruel, just the kind of amusement that came when someone was glad not to be the one in the spotlight. Imani didn't respond right away. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her, waiting to see if she'd crumble under the pressure. Holloway, sensing hesitation, pressed on. "I mean, think about it. That little gold cross. Does it actually do anything? Has it ever stopped a tragedy, fixed a broken heart? Or is it just a piece of metal with a history that people keep repeating to themselves because they're afraid of uncertainty? More laughter now, a little louder this time. Imani's grip on her pen tightened, but her face remained still. Holloway continued, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had done this dozens of times before. You're a smart young woman, Miss Rhodes. I imagine you've read Plato, Kant, Nietzsche, philosophers who spent their lives questioning reality. But here you are, holding onto a trinket as if it holds the key to the universe. Tell me, if you lost it tomorrow, would anything in your life actually change? Silence. Imani exhaled slowly. She could feel the knot forming in her stomach, the heat rising in her face. Not from embarrassment, but from something deeper. Something that had been sitting inside her for a long time, waiting for the right moment to be spoken aloud. She looked at Holloway, really looked at him. The way he leaned back so casually, so sure of himself. The way he scanned the room, gauging reactions like an actor feeding off his audience. She could tear apart his argument if she wanted to. She had studied logic, understood fallacies, knew exactly where his reasoning was flawed. But that wasn't what this was about. This wasn't a debate. It wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about something much bigger. So she took a breath, steadied herself, and finally spoke. You think this is about logic, but it's not. A shift in the room. A pause. Students sat up a little straighter, sensing that whatever was coming next wasn't going to be what they expected. Holloway raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Oh? Then what is it about? Imani held on to the cross, her fingers resting against the metal. It's about who I am, and the people who came before me. But Holloway wasn't done yet. Holloway scoffed, shaking his head. Ah yes, the sentimental argument, he said, pushing away from the desk. He paced in front of the classroom, hands gesturing as if unraveling some grand illusion. History, heritage, a sense of belonging. Convenient, isn't it? But let's not confuse emotion with truth. You see, Miss Rhodes, what you call identity, I call conditioning. You wear that cross because someone, somewhere, told you it meant something. But strip away the stories, the traditions. What's left? Nothing but metal. An accessory with no power beyond what you assign to it. He turned back to her, arms crossed. So tell me, is that really faith, or just nostalgia wrapped in superstition? The class was dead silent. Some students stared down at their notebooks, avoiding eye contact, while others watched with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. This was what Holloway did best. Strip things down to their bare bones, leaving people exposed with nothing to hold on to. But Imani didn't look away. She could have fought back with cold logic, could have thrown academic theories at him like so many others had tried before. But Holloway didn't need another argument. He needed something real, so she spoke. You see this cross? She said, holding it up slightly so the light caught it again. This was my grandmother's. She gave it to me the night before she died. A ripple of stillness moved through the room. Even Holloway's smirk faltered just slightly. She was born in 1943, Imani continued, her voice steady but thick with something deeper. She grew up in a time when people like her weren't allowed in certain schools, when she had to sit at the back of a bus, when her faith was one of the only things no one could take from her. Holloway's expression shifted, but he said nothing. She wore this cross through marches, through nights when she wasn't sure if my mother would make it home safe. She held on to it when they threatened to burn down her church. And when I was a little girl, she told me something I'll never forget. Imani looked down at the cross, her fingers brushing over it gently before she lifted her gaze back to Holloway. She told me, faith isn't about proving something to people who don't believe. It's about knowing who you are, even when the world tries to tell you otherwise. A few students shifted in their seats, their eyes flicking between Imani and Holloway. Imani let her words settle before she continued. You say, this is just metal, she said quietly. Maybe it is, but when my grandmother held it, it was a reminder that she wasn't alone. When I wear it, it reminds me that no matter how much doubt there is in the world, there's something bigger than myself that keeps me standing. You call that conditioning. I call it strength. Holloway opened his mouth, but for the first time, nothing came out. Imani leaned forward slightly. You asked me if I've ever questioned my faith, she said. I have, and every time I do, I find another reason to hold on to it. But the real shift wasn't happening with Holloway. It was happening with the rest of the room. A thick silence hung over the room. It wasn't the kind of silence that begged to be broken. It was the kind that pressed down on everyone, heavy and unshakable. Even the students who had chuckled earlier now sat frozen, their gazes locked on Imani. Something had shifted. Holloway had spent years dismantling belief systems, stripping away sentiment like peeling back layers of an onion. He had seen people fumble, stutter, shrink under the weight of his scrutiny. But Imani, she wasn't fighting him. She wasn't arguing in the way he expected. She was just speaking. Raw, honest, unapologetic. For the first time, the power in the room wasn't his. A student near the back, a guy who had been half asleep through most of the semester, sat up a little straighter. Another, a girl who always took meticulous notes but rarely spoke, wiped at her eye discreetly. Then something unexpected happened. A voice from the side of the room broke the silence. "My grandmother used to say the same thing," a student murmured. Heads turned. Imani looked over to see Tasha Bennett, a sophomore with dark curls and thick-rimmed glasses. She was fidgeting with the ring on her finger, her voice quiet but steady. She was in Alabama during the protests. She used to say faith was the only thing they couldn't take from her. Another voice from the other side of the room. "I had a necklace like that once," Ryan Liu admitted. "It belonged to my mom. I lost it a few years ago, and I don't know why, but I still feel like a piece of me is missing without it." A murmur swept through the class. Small nods, shared glances, students looking at one another like they were seeing something they hadn't noticed before. Even those who didn't say anything were affected. The energy in the room had shifted from passive observation to something deeper, and Holloway felt it. He wasn't used to this. He was used to control, to steering conversations in his direction, to being the one everyone turned to for intellectual guidance. But now, the discussion had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer about him. It was about them. For the first time, his class wasn't just an exercise in argumentation. It was real. His fingers curled slightly at his side. He could break it. He knew that. He could redirect, regain control, dismiss their experiences as emotional bias. He had done it before, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way Imani was watching him, not with anger, not with defiance, but with something else. Something he couldn't quite place. Or maybe it was the way his own chest felt tight in a way he hadn't expected. He took a slow breath, and for once, he didn't have a clever retort. But what happened next was something even he didn't see coming. Holloway swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He had spent his career dismantling belief systems with precision, reducing faith to nothing more than a relic of human insecurity. Yet now, standing in his own classroom, he found himself at a loss for words. He glanced around, noticing how the room had changed. It wasn't just Imani anymore. It was the entire class. They weren't looking at him for validation, for his signature smirk of intellectual victory. They were looking at each other. It was unnerving. His gaze flickered back to Imani. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't basking in the moment. She was just there, steady, unshaken, and that unsettled him more than anything else. He cleared his throat, forcing his voice to its usual measured tone. "That's a compelling story, Miss Rhodes," he said finally, though the words didn't carry the same weight they usually did. But emotion doesn't prove truth. The fact that something is meaningful to you doesn't mean it's real. Imani tilted her head slightly. "And the fact that something isn't meaningful to you doesn't mean it's not," she countered. Holloway let out a slow breath through his nose. He was losing control of the discussion. He could feel it slipping, and he didn't like it. Then, something unexpected happened. An older student near the front, Jordan Matthews, a military veteran studying philosophy after years of service, spoke up. His voice was calm but firm. "Professor, can I ask you something?" Holloway exhaled sharply, regaining his footing. "That's what this class is for, Mr. Matthews." Jordan leaned forward slightly. "You always talk about questioning everything. That's why I signed up for this class. You challenge people, make them think. But I gotta ask, when was the last time you questioned yourself?" A ripple of surprise moved through the students. Holloway stiffened. Jordan continued, his voice steady. "You push people to doubt what they believe. But have you ever turned that same doubt on yourself? Ever stopped to ask why it matters so much to you that people let go of their faith? The room was so quiet. Holloway could hear the faint ticking of the clock above the whiteboard. For the first time, he felt the weight of the scrutiny he usually placed on others pressing down on him. And he hated it. He could respond. He could dismiss it. He could say what he always said, that his job was to force people to think critically, to challenge ideas, to ensure they weren't blindly accepting things just because they were told to. But that wasn't the full truth, was it? There was something deeper, something unspoken, that made him push harder than necessary. Maybe it was the memory of his own childhood, growing up in a strict religious household where questions were met with cold silence. Maybe it was the night he stopped praying, waiting for an answer that never came. Maybe it was the way faith had always felt like a chain around his neck rather than a source of comfort. Maybe it was because deep down he envied people like Imani, people who still believed. He clenched his jaw. "I don't need to question myself, Mr. Matthews," he said finally, his voice controlled, but lacking its usual confidence. "I already have." Jordan didn't argue. He just nodded. And for the first time in his career, Dr. Holloway felt like he had lost something. Something he couldn't quite name, but the real lesson was yet to come. Class ended 10 minutes later, but no one rushed out like they usually did. The usual shuffle of backpacks, the scraping of chairs against the floor, none of it happened. Instead, students moved slowly, some glancing back at Imani as they packed their things. A few lingered near the door, whispering to each other in hushed tones. Holloway remained at his desk, pretending to sort through papers. In reality, he was stalling. He didn't want to leave first. He knew that if he walked out now, it would feel like retreating. And he refused to accept that. But then Imani did something he didn't expect. She walked up to him. She didn't look smug. She didn't look like someone who had just won a debate. If anything, she looked calm, steady, just as she had been the entire time. Holloway set his pen down and met her gaze. Imani studied him for a moment before speaking. "You know," she said softly, "if you ever did want to talk about what made you stop believing, I'd listen." Holloway blinked. Of all the things she could have said, that was the last thing he expected. Not an argument, not a parting shot, an offer. He could have brushed it off, could have laughed, could have told her that his personal beliefs weren't relevant to the discussion. But something about the way she said it made it impossible to dismiss. Because deep down, he knew she wasn't trying to change him. She was just giving him space, something he had never given others. Holloway exhaled, glancing at the cross still hanging around her neck. For the first time, it didn't look like a symbol of superstition. It looked like something much harder to define. He gave a slow nod. "I'll think about it." Imani smiled, not in triumph, but in understanding. That's all anyone can ask for. She turned and walked toward the door, slipping out into the hallway. Holloway sat there for a long time, staring down at the desk, fingers tapping idly against the wood. For the first time in years, he felt something shift. Not in the room, not in the class. In himself. Sometimes, the greatest debates aren't won by proving someone wrong. They're won by being willing to listen, by sharing something real, by offering understanding instead of combat. Maybe you've been in a situation like Imani, challenged for what you believe in. Or maybe you've been like Holloway, convinced that questioning something means tearing it apart. But what if real understanding isn't about proving a point? What if it's about finding common ground? If this story made you think, let us know in the comments. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the power of belief, no matter what form it takes.